The Anglican way of approaching Christianity has been called the Via Media. We carry that forth in the Episcopal Church. It's more a both and place rather than an either or. It's more on the one hand this, but on the other hand this, and all of it together, and then ideally those seeming oppositions transcend each other into something new and something more profound. And also there's a certain humility in it that we don't, we're never absolutely certain. So on the one hand, when we read the Bible, we always need to remember that the stories that it tells, the lessons that it teaches, originated in a culture and historical situation quite different from our own. We think differently than they thought. Our experiences would be foreign to them, and their experiences foreign to us. Our worlds are different. Our sense of nature, our communication styles, the pace of life, basic values probably. All these are very hard in some ways to compare and connect. And all that colors how well we can really understand and apply what we read to the situations in our own lives without falling into the trap of reading in things, of finding in the scriptures teachings and lessons that actually are the teachings and lessons that we want to find, but that aren't really there. And also then missing the teaching and the lessons that really are there because they don't quite fit to our way of being and understanding things. On the other hand, much of the world that we live in, the modern world, the culture we have, the values that we share, actually began to be formed in and through the biblical narrative. So there is connection. Looking at the Ten Commandments that we heard again in the reading from Exodus this morning as an example, we really don't know how those people hearing those words of Moses would have understood the Bible and what Moses says in the Ten Commandments as the way that we understand it. They may have seen it entirely differently. The Bible situates this story in the wilderness wanderings of the people between slavery and promise, and it gains significance through that. And the presentation of these commandments is looked back upon in Jewish tradition as the formative point of the chosen people, as formative and as important, if not more so, than as the call to Abraham. This is the point when they became sort of the people of Israel in a covenant with God. So there's a communal sense to this story that I'm not sure we pick up on in our very individualized world with its choice of faith and codes of personal behavior. We don't know how they saw this. And yet, on the other hand, the commandments do flow into our understanding of right and wrong. They are, in fact, put in the singular. They're addressed to individuals. That's an important point. We miss that with our modern English because we use the word you to mean both singular and plural of the second person, formal and familiar. Whereas the old-fashioned sounding thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not covet, really is closer to the original. Because the word thou, although we think it sounds fancy, was the singular familiar that you just used with regular people, friends, and children. And so there is this individualism, this between communalism and individualism. There is this, the sense of the importance of the individual, which so marks our culture in relationship to each other, in relationship to God, was something very new back then. We take it for granted, but people back then came mainly in tribes or empires or language groups or social classes. At the very smallest unit, they came in families, but they were always extended families, large families. So this here, if it is spoken to individuals, is the start of something, the birth of a responsible ego, in a way. That's only grown and become very dominant in our culture, at least in the West. And maybe it's grown too much. Maybe we've lost the sense of community in our pretty much self-centered, alienated individualism. But this perception of personal choice of action, to steal or not, to honor or not, to covet or not, to murder or not, is a really important thing. And it's a part of the tradition that comes from these stories and still continues today, for good or ill, or both. So, maybe they had a different sense than we do, but they had some commonality on this communal versus individual spectrum. And there's also a question surrounding how important our behavior is to God or our relationship with God. The human side of the divine-human relationship for most of human history called for very specialized action in the spiritual realm. Specialized action that was often undertaken only by specialized people like shamans, medicine men, things like that. It involved acts of worship, it involved sacrificial acts, rituals of one kind or another, much more than it involved some sense of our general behavior in our regular lives. There were, of course, taboos and acts of propitiation that might surround some kinds of regular activities like food or sex. But it was all very different from what we consider to be morality, a personal moral code. It was specifically religious. And I think that speaks to our potential misunderstanding of these commandments, because what's outlined here seems seamlessly connected to acts like, cutting pigeons in two and selling cattle or something outside the temple to take in and sacrifice, and behavior that's really strange, and yet thou shalt not steal seems perfectly reasonable. And yet they were part of the same religious structure. And it makes me wonder whether or not I really understand what's being said. On the other hand, this too may just be the start of something. The beginning of a demythologized, less ritualized, more generalized real-world connection between what could be called religion and what evolves as regular secular life in the modern world. I mean, it may be that while everybody else had this sort of ritualized behavior, one of the things that happens for the Jewish people is they discover it involves just regular life. And that could be a shift rather than seeing them in the former way of being. Because this is a process that grows throughout Jewish culture. The prophets who came later emphasize normal, regular behavior over ritual and sacrifice. Hosea says God desires steadfast love and not sacrifice. Amos says God despises the festivals, but calls for justice to roll down like water and righteousness like a never-flowing stream. So, how do we understand these commandments? Are they fit into sort of a ritual pattern that we don't quite get, or are they the precursors of our modern legal and moral system? In some ways, Christianity can be seen, or what's called Christianity, can be seen as coming into being as a division in a bifurcation in the Jewish tradition, a division into two different streams. One stream being Rabbinic Judaism that evolves to be the Rabbinic Judaism that we know as Judaism in the world today, and the other being the church as it grows and changes. Both seen as alternative adaptations when Jerusalem and the temple were destroyed and Christians were expelled from the synagogues. So both of these streams emphasize behavior. So they both look to the commandments. But in Rabbinic Judaism, they studied the Torah and other writings, interpreting what they read in the light of their experience, an ongoing experience, an ongoing understanding that's recorded in the Talmud, coming up at least in one version with 613 commandments to govern nearly all aspects of life, and thus setting this people apart from the Gentile world into which they'd been dispersed. Whereas the early church was kind of different. The church emphasized behavior too, a quite rigid code of behavior that was more ascetic and in a way world-denying than the rabbis, and having less sort of finding less compromise with the Roman world, honoring celibacy and poverty, and seeing martyrdom as the highest expression of faith, but then being open to, I don't want to say being co-opted, but open to becoming more accepted at the time of the Emperor Constantine, when the church becomes really the voice, the agent for moral and righteous behavior within the reigning political structure, and it in turn supports that reigning political structure. And that happens again and again and again throughout church history. The church leads what is considered right in terms of behavior, and it supports the powers that be. That was true in medieval times as well as Constantine's time, and it was true in 1950s America when they added "under God" to the Pledge of Allegiance, and when Billy Graham, God rest his soul, won fame as America's pastor. It was sort of the idea was that was what Christianity was all about. Colloquially, acting like a good Christian meant doing the right thing. So, while individualism and a modern understanding of morality were certainly not a part of the spirituality there at the foot of Mount Sinai, the seeds of both these developments can be found in that place at that time. The affirmation of the covenant with God that was then, and that we assert we're part of even now. But I think we can go deeper than that. I think we can go beyond that. I think we can transcend both these ideas of community and individualism and different sorts of emphasis on behavior as a way of life or whatever, and find another way. See, the most common way, I think now, that the Ten Commandments are understood are part of a contractual agreement. We agree to do or not to do these 10 things, and God will do certain things for us. Protect us, maybe favor us, at least reward us in the end, or at least not visit upon our great and great grandchildren the results of our sin. We just have to be good girls and boys. And that, not accidentally, helps us fit in society. Because there's still a communal element to our obedience, and there's social consequences for our disobedience. You just have to look down at Soledad, at the 2 prisons there, to see what that consequence can be. And the powers of this world are still in charge, and we don't want to ruffle their feathers. Liz is even worried they're going to take away my deductions for my rectory allowance. But what if these commandments are not something we do for God, but something God does for us, or really more part of what we and God are doing together? That they're not the rules and regulations, either for life or for faith or for kosher living or any of that. What if the commandments aren't limits to our behavior, that we have to toe the line and sources of guilt and shame when we fail to do it, but rather somehow invitations to a new way of being that was new back then and is still new now. Instructions in authentic wholeness, which is much more than stereotypical holiness that we think of when we think of commandments? What if these aren't really commandments at all? It doesn't use that word all that much in the scripture. But parts of a recipe for a higher, deeper life with God and with each other. What if all this is not some model for conformity to an outer standard that's imposed by a demanding God or a punishing judiciary? But a way, or part of a way, that allows us to be unique expressions of a loving God's overflowing Spirit in the space and time of our lives. Ways that we can learn to shape creation for and with God in ways that nobody else can. It's our special call. So it's not, these commandments aren't all do the same thing you do and everybody ought to do, but they give clues, they give hints if we look through them at what God is calling us to do in each situation. To offer our special piece of the jigsaw puzzle of human history. What if acting in this way, figuring out how to specifically apply what's said here to the whole of our daily life is not some kind of legalistic transaction, but really a joint venture in the creation of universal being. The word for commandment, or the word that's translated commandment, is mitzvah. And it's used a lot of different ways in the Bible. And as I said, it's only used a couple times in this passage. But it's connected in its verbal root, in its Semitic root, with the concept of binding or uniting more than it is kind of obedience or anything like that, or a call to obedience, an order to follow. This passage from Exodus, as connected to that ancient, forgotten spiritual practice as it may be, and as central to our modern values and culture and systems of laws and interpersonal ethics as it may be, still have something for us to discover if we take the time and forget that we hear it over and over and over again. Watch the movie with Charlton Heston again. Just think about it from a different angle. We can discover something for ourselves, for our church, for all of life on earth, as we continue our journey in this wilderness between slavery and promise. Thanks be to God.